So we'll be discussing about the impairment of financial asset. So yesterday we have discussed about the treatment of financial asset. So today we'll discuss about the impairment with respect to IFRS 9. So impairment of financial assets. So with respect to the impairment of financial assets, how will you normally account for impairment? Which is the standard we used to use to account for the impairment?
IAS 36.
How do we normally account for the impairment? Which is the standard we'll use to account for the impairment?
36, IAS 36.
Yeah, so normally we'll use IAS 36. But when it comes to impairment of financial asset, we have a separate treatment as it is referred in IFRS 9 itself. So the standard itself have given certain guidelines on how to account for the impairment of financial assets. So the impairment of financial asset mainly happens with debt investments, and debt investments which are accounted using amortized cost model and FAT OCI model. So the impairment will mainly affect these two models, which is amortized cost model and FAT OCI model. Okay, the impairment will not affect those debt investments which are treated using FAT P&L model. Can you just tell me why? What's the reason for it? Why it will not affect the financial instruments which are treated under FAT P&L model, the impairment? Can you reply in the chat, guys? Because if it is FAT P&L model, the gain or loss is getting immediately reflected in the P&L itself. So we don't need to charge for that movement again in the P&L. So if there is a reduction in the value, it will get reflected directly in the P&L immediately because it's a fair value through P&L model. So that's the reason when it comes to impairment of debt investments, that will only affect those debt investments which are accounted using amortized cost model and FAT OCI model. Is it clear? So when it comes to the debt investments, when we are investing in a debt investment, we know that there is a risk, there is a higher risk associated with investing in the debt investments of a company, such as the loan notes, okay, compared to what the risk we have to bear when we are investing in a government security. So we know that when we invest in the government security, we will get a return that is, let's say, 5%. That's a risk-free return. Without taking any risk, we are getting the return there. But when we are investing in the debt investments, we'll get a return which is higher compared to the risk-free return. Let's say about 8% or around 10%. So why they are giving that extra return here? What's the reason they are giving this extra return when you're investing in the loan notes or debt instruments of a company instead of with respect to the investments in government securities? Why they are giving a higher return here? It's because of the higher risk. So we know that by default, at the initial recognition of debt investments in our books, at that point itself we know that there is a risk associated to it, isn't it? Because we already accept that risk. We already accept that risk because that's the reason we are expecting a higher return there. Is it clear, guys? Can you reply in the chat? Okay. So when it comes to impairment of financial asset, especially for debt investments which are accounted using amortized cost model or FAT OCI model, at the initial recognition on debt investments in our books. So at that point itself, we need to create an allowance for future expected losses. So what is the expected losses with respect to a debt investment? What are your expected losses? Won't be able to realize the expected cash flows, the expected interest, or the expected redemption value. From that debt investment, there will be a difference with respect to what we actually expect and your real cash flows, isn't it? So at the initial recognition of a debt investments in our books, at that point itself, we need to create an allowance for this future expected losses. Clear? So this future expected losses can literally be accounted by considering the expected losses in the first 12 months. So at the initial recognition itself, we'll consider the probable chances of any default events which are expected to happen in the next 12 months, and we'll create a allowance for it. So that is known as 12 months expected loss allowance. So at the initial recognition itself, we'll create this, that is 12 months expected loss allowance. Is it clear, everyone? Can you reply in the chat?
Yes.
Yes. So this loss allowance will get charged to P&L. So this loss allowance will get charged to P&L. At the same time, make sure that since it's a loss allowance, it's not, we haven't got any impairment indicator that the impairment is not confirmed. So it's just an allowance that we create. So this value should not be deducted from the gross amount of a financial asset. So when you're asked to calculate the net carrying amount of financial asset, of that particular financial asset, we can deduct it. Let's say 100 million is your bond value. So from the 100 million, if you have calculated a 1 million as a loss allowance, the 12 months loss allowance is 1 million. And the carrying amount in the books will be 99 million. But the next accounting period, again, we have to calculate the fair value, right? So we have to calculate the effective rate of interest. So it will be opening value of financial asset plus effective rate. That's how we'll account for it. And then minus coupon received is equal to closing. This is how we'll account for a financial asset, right? Using amortized cost model. So when we create an allowance, since the impairment is not confirmed, but we are just creating an allowance there. So in that scenario, the next accounting period, when we calculate the effective rate of interest, the question here is, will you calculate this effective interest rate on 99 million or on 100 million? On which figure? Is it on 99 million or on 100? It is on 100. Very good. So always we will calculate the effective rate of interest on the gross figure unless this financial asset is credit impaired. Unless the financial asset is credit impaired. Is it clear, everyone? But if the financial asset credit is getting impaired, in that scenario, we will deduct it. We'll deduct this impaired amount from your assets value, and finally, in the subsequent period, we will be calculating that effective rate on that carrying amount, not on the gross figure. Is it clear, everyone? Can you reply in the chat? Yeah, fine. So sometimes this 12 months allowance will get replaced. By lifetime expected allowance. When it will happen? when that 12 months expected allowance will get replaced by lifetime expected allowance? If
See,
there is a
significant
if there is an increase in the credit risk, if there is an increase in the credit risk of that financial asset, let's say the borrower, there are chances that the borrower will enter bankrupt, or the company from which we are actually taken this debt investment, is that whole industry is facing some recession this time, like the whole industry is not performing well. So as a result, we can say that there is a higher chance of losing out the money there. Are you getting it? So in that situation, so with respect to this 12 months expected allowance, will get replaced by a lifetime expected allowance. Lifetime expected allowance means here we will consider, let's say the bond duration is for 5 years. With respect to 12 months allowance, we used to only consider the chances of default events which are about to happen in the next 12 months. But when the credit risk is increasing, the 12 months allowance will get replaced by a lifetime expected allowance. So lifetime expected allowance means we literally consider all possible events that can happen in the remaining period, that is till the date of maturity. Whatever the possible default events that can happen in the remaining period, we will consider those situations to create the allowance for the whole lifetime. Are you getting it? Yes. So that's how we'll create the impairment. That's how we'll account for the impairment of debt investments. So there is 12 months allowance as well as there is lifetime expected allowance. So initially we'll always give a 12 months allowance on the initial recognition itself without any indicators. Because even if the credit risk is not significant, immediately at the initial recognition, we have to create a 12 months allowance. The reason being, by default, we know that at the point of purchasing a debt investment itself, there is a higher risk compared to a government security. So it's under prudent concept, we have to create an allowance there because we are expecting losses, isn't it? So we won't wait for the indicators to give an indication that, okay, we have to create an allowance. At the moment when we purchase a financial asset, initial recognition itself will create a 12 months allowance. And subsequently, it will get replaced by a lifetime allowance if the credit risk is increasing. So how will you get to know it? There are indicators which will be given in the scenarios. You have to read it. Or sometimes they used to say directly that the credit risk will increase, or they will give some certain hints that will help you to figure out the fact that, okay, the risk has been increased. Is it clear, everyone? And with respect to financial asset impairment, and if it is following FET-OCA model, so instead of crediting this amount to the financial asset value, we'll credit the debit will go to the debit allowance charge will go to P&L and the credit will go to OCA there. There, the credit allowance will go to OCA. That's the only difference when it comes to amortized cost model and FET-OCA model. Because in FET-OCA model, the asset will be already shown in the fair value, right? So we don't need to credit the value again. It's like a double accounting. So if here the allowance charge will get accounted as a part of your other comprehensive income. It will not get deducted from the value of asset under FET-OCA model. So these are the main aspects we have to learn, or we have to remember with respect to the treatment of debt investments, especially with the impairment of debt investments. Is it clear, everyone? Okay, so we'll do one question from the past paper with respect to this area. Just 1 minute. So just read this question with respect to, it is with respect to impairment of financial. Just read the first part of the question. Read the A part. Okay, so the director wish to know how to account for the debt investment until its sale. So just go through it. So guys, have you gone through it? So here, is it a debt investment which is accounted using FET-OCA model or FET-PL model? Sorry, or amortized cost model. What type of debt investment it is? Yeah, it is using FET-OCA, right? We will discuss the answer. So can you now see the weight file? Yeah, so we'll discuss about it. So here, first of all, we should write the guidance on how to treat financial, and so whatever we have learned with respect to that debt investment impairment, we have to write the main points there, okay, as a principle. So first of all, guidance for how to treat financial asset debt investment if it is accounted as per FET OCI. So any fair value gain will be recognized in OCI, and subsequently this gain will be reclassified to P&L because it is a debt investment. We have discussed about it yesterday. The expected credit loss allowance will be recognized in OCI, and it will not reduce the carrying amount of financial asset. The value will remain at fair value itself, isn't it? Because it is FAT OCI model. Then hereby considering the fair value as per active market, the financial asset has gone down from, so as per the, there is two values, there is in-house model and there is an active market value. So which one we should consider? Which one we should consider? Will you use the in-house value of 5.5 or the active market value? You have to use the active market, right? Yes. So with respect to the active market, the value became how much? 5.3 from 6 million. So the question here is, how will you recognize the loss allowance of 700,000? So first of all, there is a loss allowance they have recognized. How much? 400,000. Even if you're looking at the revision gate, you won't get it the entry correctly. So I will do it in step-by-step way. So there is an impairment anyway from 5.6 million to 5.3. So how will you account for it? How will you account for that impairment? It will be debit.
SOPL.
Yes, SOPL, and credit the financial
Okay.
asset. Asset value has gone down, right? By how much? 700,000.
No.
And they have already recognized an allowance. So how will you recognize the allowance in FET OCI model? It is debit to P&L. How much? 400,000, and credit OCI, because we have told that the loss allowance will be recognized in OCI. Okay, so effectively that decrease in the value of asset by 700,000. If you are looking at the effective rate, so how will you account for it? How will you account for it? Effectively, this charge. Sorry, just 1 minute. This entry should be debit to OCI, okay? Because the fair value movement happened in OCI, so it should be debit to OCI 700,000, and credit financial asset 700,000. Sorry guys, because it is FET OCI model. So this is the entry for impairment, and this is the entry for that 12 months allowance. So effectively, that decrease in the value of that asset, if you are just comparing this to entry, how will you account for it? That effective, that overall impairment of 700,000 is getting charged to P&L. How much? 400,000, and debit to OCI 700,000 and credit to OCI 400,000. So how much is the charge effectively to OCI? What's the effective charge to OCI? 300,000. So if you're looking at the backside of the revision gate, you may get confused because there they have used that effective calculation. So how will you? So if you're looking at the answer in the back, this is how they have explained it. So I have just shown here how will you get that answer? Like you may get a confusion that so why the 400,000 is getting charged to P&L, 300,000 to OCA. So it's a result of these two adjusting entries. Okay. So the total loss of 700,000 will be charged in the following manner. So 400,000 will get charged as impairment loss, and remaining 300,000 should be charged to OCA. And if you want, you can, here they are not asked for any entries, so it's not required to pass the entry. But if you are more knowledgeable about the accounting entries, you can pass the entry there. Then it will give a better clarity to your answer. So is it clear, everyone, how to account for it? How to account for that impairment of financial asset, especially debt investment using FET OCA model? So the allowance charge will not reduce the asset's value, it should be credited to OCA. And since it is an FET OCA model, the fair value movement should be reflected in OCA, not in the P&L. So that's what here we won't credit it to, normally we'll credit the financial asset value, because here when we create an allowance, we are not reducing the financial asset value, because we assume that since it's already shown at the fair value, no, we don't need to deduct the value again. That's why we are crediting it to OCA, the allowance charge. Is it clear? So that may be a confusing area with respect to impairment. So this is the only question we have with respect to impairment in the depreciator. There's a question in the past paper, but I'll just refer that question. I forgot the question name, but I think this question clearly explains you how to account for the impairment and how to pass the entry. So is it clear, everyone? So that's it for the main areas of financial instrument, and this hedge accounting is not something that really looking for. I don't prefer you to take more serious about it. I'll just share two recordings on the hedge accounting part. Can just go through it. You'll get an idea that what do you mean by cash flow hedge and this fair value hedge, and that knowledge is enough even if they ask something. But literally they don't ask anything from the hedge accounting part, because that's a it's not like something which can actually examinable in the SPR. They haven't tested it as much. Okay, so I personally feel like you should not focus more. Now is towards the end of this exam, like to hardly you have got 2 or 3 weeks. So focus on the main areas. These are very less important areas to be get focused on. And even if you have any doubts after covering the main syllabus, such as the other standards, if you have any doubts after watching that recording of fair value hedge or cash flow hedge, you can ask me in the group, or you can just contact me. I'll discuss about it. But preferably at the end, towards at the end. Otherwise, what will happen? You will simply waste the time in learning that confusing area, and literally you won't, even if they are not asking anything from it, literally it's a waste of time. So play smartly towards the end and don't get waste your time on these areas. Okay, guys. So that's it. Effectively, these are the areas that you have to learn with respect to financial instrument, the impairment and its treatment. That's the main area we have to focus. Shall we do another question? We'll do some 2 or 3 questions from the other areas to get a better knowledge about financial. Shall we do it? Okay. So just read this question. Question number A. Just go through it. It's about treatment of financial assets. So that's what I've said. So there will be questions about the treatment of financial asset, as well as this hedge impairment part. So just read that question. First part A. So have you read the question, guys? Have you read the question? Okay, guys, so we'll discuss about it. So here it's a loan which you have issued to your employees, and it's an interest-free loan. So we know that whenever we recognize the financial asset in our books, it should be recognized at the fair value. So do you think that if you recognize the opening value of this financial asset as 10 million, is it appropriate to do it? Is it appropriate to recognize the whole 10 million which you have issued to the employee as an asset? No, because you are only getting repaid as 10 million without any interest after 2 years. So literally they are not compensating for the time value of money there. You are not getting any compensation for the time value of money because you have issued it specifically at the non-market terms. Isn't it? Yeah. So whenever you feel like the loan, let's say for a deep discount, like interest rate which is at a lower interest rate, or this kind of interest-free loan, in that situation, the loan granted to the employee should be accounted as a financial asset. So as per IFRS 9, the financial asset will be initially recognized at fair value, and since it meets the business test, that because they have told that it's not about any kind of trading or something like that, so we have to account for it as per amortized cost model. So here the fair value of the interest rate free loan should be estimated. It will be the present value of its future cash flows because it is insured to employees at the non-market terms. Okay. So here the fair value of the financial asset will be calculated by discounting this cash flows at the market rate 6%. So it will be 10 million into, will get discounted for 2 years. So the initial value will be how much? 8.9 million. So the difference between 8.9 million and 10 million, how will you account for it? We'll account it as a cost or an expense. So we can, since it is given to employee, we can say it is an employee benefit that we have offered. Okay. So that 1.1 million will be accounted as a employment benefit. So after the initial recognition of 8.9 million, this will get subsequently accounted using amortized cost model. So 8.9 will be the opening value plus 8.9, we have to charge the effective rate of interest, which is 6%. And literally there is no interest rate received. So the closing value will be 9.43 million. So 8.9% into 6, this percentage will be accounted as an income in your P&L. We'll account it as a income in P&L. So apart from that, we have to recognize a loss allowance of 12 months for this financial asset, since they have told that the credit risk is low. So here they are mentioning about the credit risk, and since the credit risk is low here, we will only need to recognize a impairment loss for the 12 months credit allowance, and this allowance will get charged to P&L, and since it is amortized cost model, will be reduced from the carrying amount of financial assets. Is it clear, everyone? We just need to discuss the treatment. That's it. No, it's not correct. It's not correct. Should be reversed. That's an incorrect treatment. I've just discussed about the correct accounting treatment. Is it clear? Yeah, we have to reverse it. Whatever the charge they have made to P&L as cost of sales, we need to reverse it from there and just credit it back to the appropriate treatment. So charge made to cost of sales should be reversed back. You can just say that it should be derecognized and this is the actual accounting treatment. Otherwise, you can just show the correction entry. It's up to you. Because anyway, they haven't just talking about any kind of entries here. Okay. Just mention the fact that whatever the entry we have made to cost of sales should be reversed and this is how it should be accounted. Clear? Fine. So that's it. So we have discussed about financial instrument. Majorly, we have done questions from that part as well. And now we'll discuss about the other two important accounting standard with respect to IFRS 2 and IAS 19. IFRS 2 and IAS 19. So can you see that Word file? Okay. So next one we are going to discuss about IAS 19. So IAS 19 it mainly deals with employment benefit. So what do you mean by employment benefits? So the benefits that we provide to employees. So it can be different types. It can be short-term benefits as well as long-term benefits, and it will also include post-employment benefits. So when it comes to the revision, we are just focusing on post-employment benefit because that's the most importantly tested area. So the post-employment benefits. So what do you mean by post-employment benefit? The benefits that we provide to our employees post their resignation from the company. So it's almost like pension scheme and all this stuff. So here the question is, how will you account for this post-employment benefit? So we have got two choices. What are they? Defined contribution scheme and defined benefit scheme. So there are two choices for it: defined contribution scheme and defined benefit scheme. So what do you mean by defined contribution scheme? Here, defined contribution, that is the contribution that we have to pay to the company, it is defined. Are you getting it? The contribution that we have to pay to our company employee by the company to the scheme. So here we'll literally give this pension scheme to an external party, to a PF agency or something like that. And every year the company will give a fixed contribution to the scheme. That's it. And this pension company might deposit it to any kind of other investment or mutual funds or any other company's asset So they will try to create an asset, and through that asset pool, the returns that they get from that asset pool of asset will be used to pay the pension to the employees in future. But literally for the employer, that is for the company, their obligation will end once we made that contribution to the separate entity. So here, whatever the contribution I have to make to that separate entity, to that PF agency, is fixed. So my obligation limits to that contribution which I have made to the PF company. Are you getting it? That's why it is known as defined contribution scheme. We know what we have to contribute. And what about defined benefit scheme? In defined benefit scheme, we are promising that a percentage of this much percentage of your final salary will be paid as pension to the employee. To the worker, we are promising them a fixed percentage of return to the worker. So here, whatever the benefit that ultimately the employee is going to receive, that is defined. So that's why it is known as defined benefit scheme. Are you getting it? Can you reply in the chat? So there is defined benefit scheme and defined contribution scheme. I hope you understood what's the difference between these two items. So whenever you feel like, okay, we have an obligation to pay something extra than what we actually contribute to the scheme, then we'll call it as defined benefit scheme. And defined contribution means like we only need to pay a fixed contribution. We are not liable to pay anything excess if the asset is if that pool of asset is not performing well. So if it's a defined contribution scheme, the accounting treatment is really easy. We'll account it using accrual basis. It's just the accrual basis. Let's say in the current year we have to contribute 60,000, but you only contributed 55. Then that another 5,000 will be accounted as an accrued expense. So that accrual basis accounting treatment is what we follow for defined contribution scheme. Yeah, it's the main difference is bearing the risk, or we can say that we are promising a fixed amount to the employee there. So we are promising something, so it's create an obligation. So that's why it is defined benefit. The obligation, whatever the benefit we are giving to employee, it is defined. Is it clear? Eva, is it clear? Fine. But when it comes to defined benefit scheme, we have to account for the pension asset and we have to account for the pension liability. And effectively, you will show that net amount in the books. So it will be opening surplus or deficit. And since it's an obligation account, since it's a liability account, whatever which increase the liability will be considered as a positive figure, and whatever which decreases the liability will be considered as a negative figure. Okay, that's the concept we follow in this net accounting method. Because it's anyway it's an obligation, right? So it's a liability account, literally. The benefit scheme, defined benefit scheme, is a liability account. Okay, so the opening surplus means if the pension asset means the fund we have kept to pay the benefits in future. That's what it is known as pension asset. And pension liability, the present value of the future payments we have to pay, that is known as pension liability. So when we compare the fair value of our opening pension asset with the present value of your future liabilities, the present value of your pension liability, you will literally get a surplus or deficit. Okay, you will get a surplus or deficit. So this surplus will be, if it's a surplus, then it's like a negative balance, because I have told that it's a liability account. So if it is surplus means the asset is higher. And if it's a deficit means the present value of opening liability is higher compared to the asset. So this will be given in your question. The liability value and the asset value will be given in your question. If the liability is exceeding, then it's a opening deficit. So then it's a positive value. If the asset is higher, then it's a negative value. Are you getting it? Can you reply in the chat? Then we know that on the pension asset which you have created, we would have invested it somewhere in the market related securities, so we can get the returns from it at the rate of market rate of interest. So we'll get interest from the pension asset, as well as we'll get interest from the liability. There will be interest for the present value of the liability due to that kind of unwinding factor. So there will be there will be interest expense on, we have to incur interest expense on the pension liability. So we'll net it off and we'll get net interest component. So that is known as the net interest component. So this net interest component will be accounted if it is higher for asset. If the income is higher, then it's a negative value. If the expense is higher, then it's a positive value. So this net interest component will get charged to SOPL. It will get charged in SOPL. Then we have something known as service cost. So what do you mean by service cost? What do you mean by service cost? It's the present value of the payment which you have to pay with respect to the current year service that we received from our employees. But are we paying it right now? No. Even though it's our expense for the current period, we are paying for it in the future. So service cost means, especially the current service cost means, it's a present value of future cash flow that we have to pay with respect to the service that we have received from our employees in the current period. Are you getting it? Okay, so the service cost will include current service cost, it will include past service cost, as well as it will include the gain or loss on settlement. So these three factors will get included in the service cost. The current service cost, the past. Past means, let's say in the past, we have accounted for this liability at a lower amount. Lower amount means, let's say in the current year, there is some kind of amendments to the plan. Amendments to the plan means, let's say, till last year, I was promising 5% of the final salary as the pension. The current year, I have increased it to 8%. So that increase in liability have changed from the current year. So because of the amendment in the plan, but this increase, that extra 3% liability is not recorded in your previous years. So we have to immediately account for it now, isn't it? So that is known as past service cost. Then gain or loss on settlement or curtailment. So settlement means when an employee, let's say I'm working with KPMG, now I'm moving to EY. So I have a pension account in KPMG. So literally when I'm moving from one employee to another, the KPMG needs to transfer this to another account. So at the time of the transfer, there can be a gain or loss. By settling my account to the other party, on that settlement, due to the market changes, it will either result in a gain or loss. Either they have to pay more than what they expect or less than what they expect. So it will result in gain or loss on settlement in the current period. Even that should be included as a part of your service cost. The same way, there can be gain or loss on curtailments. So what do you mean by curtailment? Let's say, as a part of any restructuring policy, the company is planning to sell off a particular division, and as a result of this restructuring, many employees will lose their job, right? So there can be redundancy. Okay, so there will be a reduction in the number of employees. There will be a reduction in the number of employees from our plan. Okay, so as a result, since there is a reduction in the number of employees because of this particular restructuring plan, it will make changes to the liability value as well as the value of our asset. As a result, it will lead to any gain or loss with respect to the fair value movements of our pension asset and pension liability. Even that will get accounted as a part of your service cost. So the service cost will include current service cost, past service cost, as well as gain or loss on settlement. So it is something that increases your liability. So it's a positive value and it will be shown as a part of your SOPL. This expense will be shown as a part of your SOPL, the operating expense. Is it clear, guys? Then the contribution. If you have made any contribution into the scheme in the current year, that's a increase, that will increase the value of our asset, right? The pension asset. So it's a deduction. It will be shown as a deduction. The net liability account, it will be shown as a deduction. Okay. So now we'll get the expected deficit or surplus figure. So after making this adjustment, you will get the expected net deficit or surplus figure. Yeah, this contribution will be shown as under cash flow, a statement of cash flow. So the service cost in SOPL and the contribution will be shown in SOCF under operating activity, because it's an amount we offer to our, it's an amount that we offer to our employees, isn't it? So that's the reason we'll show it under our operating activity. Is it clear, everyone? So now we got the expected net deficit or surplus. It will get compared with the actuary value. So the actuary is a separate professional team who are more experienced in predicting this market changes and all this stuff. So based on the number of employees who is expected to leave in the future on the basis of these demographical factors, they will predict the value of the asset as well as with they will come up with the value of the asset. So we'll calculate the net deficit or surplus using the actuary value. So it will be given in the question, actuary values. So this prediction will have a change with respect to your expected net deficit or surplus. So the gain or loss, so this gain or loss, it will lead to any gain or loss. Like let's say the deficit value in our books will be higher compared to the deficit value of the actuary which is predicted, or it can be the other scenarios. Like maybe we have expected a lower liability, but actually have told that the liability is more. So in that scenario, in such a manner, there will be a difference with respect to the amount that we have calculated, the expected net deficit or surplus and actual net deficit or surplus, and it will lead to a gain or loss. This is known as remeasurement gain or actuarial gain or losses. So it will lead to any remeasurement gain or actuarial gain or losses. So where will you account it? So it will get accounted as a part of your OCI, and this gain will not, this gain or loss will not get reclassified to P&L in future. It will not get reclassified to P&L in future. Is it clear, everyone? Okay, so this is the main treatment about IAS 19. So we have to know how to deal with post-employment and post-employment benefit treatment. There are two accounting treatment: defined contribution scheme and defined benefit scheme. Literally understand that factors. Then why it cannot be reclassified? The reason being it's not a realizable amount, right? Because it's completely depends upon the market changes. It's not because of the performance that is being gained by the company. It's not because of, it's not a gain coming as a part of your operating efficiency. So it will literally distort your performance of the company. Perfect. So in IAS 19, the main factors you need to know is like how to account for the current service cost, the past service cost, and where will you record this current service cost, the net interest component, the OCI part. Okay, and you should be knowing to distinguish between, should have a good knowledge to distinguish between the defined contribution scheme and defined benefit scheme. These are the types of questions that you can expect from IAS 19. Is it clear, everyone? Can you reply in the chat? Yes. And there is a small amendment have came to IAS 19. The small amendment being, so that used to get tested every time as well. The amendment being, so here we can see that the net interest component is calculated at the starting. So always the net interest component will be calculated with respect to the opening rate of interest. But let's say in between, if there is a change or amendment in the plan, or if there is any kind of curtailment or something like that, as a result, we need to reassess this financial asset. We reassess the pension asset and liability. So from that point of time, the interest should be charged on the updated rate of interest for the remaining period. Let's say after 7 months, in a year there will be 10 months, right? So after 7 months of our accounting period, there has a redundancy or any kind of amendment to the plan or a curtailment happened there. So as a result, we need to remeasure this current service cost for the remaining period, as well as we have to remeasure the interest component on the latest, the updated rate of interest. But earlier, or even now, the IAS 19 used to follow the old treatment. Old treatment means they used to keep on use the interest rate of our opening to calculate the interest rate throughout the year, interest expense throughout the year. So that should not be allowed anymore. So that's an amendment came to IAS 19. So whenever there is a curtailment or it's a kind of settlement or anything happens in between an accounting period, for the remaining period after that settlement or curtailment, for the remaining period, the current service cost as well as this net interest component, the interest expenses should be remeasured using the latest updated information, on the basis of the latest updated inputs for the remaining period of time. Okay, so that's an amendment came to IAS 19. There are many times it has been tested in SPR. Is it clear, everyone? So these are the main points you have to remember with respect to IAS 19 as a whole. Is it clear, guys? Any doubts? Okay. So now the next standard is IFRS 2. We are going to discuss about IFRS 2, which is share-based payments. Yeah, the questions have came in the past. So we have to use the new rate of interest for the remaining period to calculate the interest expense. They have tested the same type of questions. So I will give you certain questions on the same nature. I will just do some questions. After covering the standards, I'll make you do the questions. So guys, I'm just taking a 5 minutes break. So after that, we'll discuss about IFRS 2. It's not straight away after the class. Like obviously we'll share the recordings, but it will be through the YouTube channels. Okay, but not immediately. Okay, maybe by next day, by tomorrow, by morning, we'll upload it. Okay. So next one is about IFRS 2 share-based payments. So in the share-based payment, we have to account for the share-based payments. So there are literally two types of share-based payment. What are they? Equity settled and cash settled share-based payment. So whenever in the question, especially in the question, if you're saying something on a share option, if you're offered share option to your employees, so what does it indicate? It's an equity settled share-based payment, because share option means once they exercise that share options, you have to issue the share. So ultimately the settlement will happen by issuing shares. So if you are offering share options to your employees or something like that, if you are coming across such questions in your exam, then it is IFRS 2 itself, but it should be accounted as per equity settled treatments. Then cash settlement, if you are coming across a situation of share appreciation rights. So share appreciation means if there is an increase in the value of share, that amount will get paid to employees. So it's here, it's getting paid to employees. Share appreciate, if the share value appreciate, that increase in value of the share will be given as cash to your employees. You will be getting settled in intrinsic value of that share option. Okay. So in that scenario, the SAR, if you have seen coming across anything known as SAR issued to the directors or employees, then it's an indicator that it's a cash settled share-based payment. Cash settled share-based payment. So there are two types: cash settled and equity settled. Is it clear, everyone? Can you reply in the chat? So if it is equity settled share-based payment, in that scenario, how will you account for it? The accounting entry is debit, expense, and the credit will go to equity. Here the credit will go to equity. And if it is cash settled share-based payment, then the debit will go to expense, but the credit will go to liability there. The credit will go to liability there. Because you have an obligation to pay in cash, right? So the obligation to pay cash should be accounted as a liability. So when we credit it to equity, that doesn't mean that it will get credited to share capital. It will be shown in the other components of equity, and when they actually exercise it, it will get converted to share capital. Is it clear, everyone?
Yes.
Yeah. So in the equity settled share-based payment, mainly there's a higher chance that they may come up with the equity settled share-based payment. So when it comes to equity settled share-based payment, how will you account for it? Let's say you have offered 100 options to your employees, to 50 employees, and the fair value of this option at the grant date is fair value is equal to $1, and the condition is, so condition means vesting. So there is a vesting period. Vesting period means that's a period we have to, that will be given by the employer to employee. So during that time, we have to meet the certain criteria which is mentioned there. So the vesting period, let's say if the vesting period is 3 years, the vesting period is 3 years. So if the vesting period is 3 years, then how will you account for it? If the vesting period is 3 years, then how will you account for it? Can I reply in the chat? So first one, so it will be 100 into 50 employees into $1. Okay. Let's say the 50 employees, we are offering it to 50 employees, but is it mandatory that the whole 50 employees will stay with the company till the vesting date, till the completion of the vesting date? No. So I assume that during the vesting period, during the 3-year period, a 20% will leave. A 20% of the employees will leave. So literally you need to recognize the expense only for that remaining 80%. That's a total expense. That's so multiply into 80% will give you the total expense. But we know that the vesting period is for 3 years. So it's an expense for 3 years. We don't need to show the whole amount immediately in year 1. So how will you show the expense for year 1? We should multiply it with respect to which completed 1 year. What's the total vesting period? This 3 years. So that's the amount we'll show it as an expense in the P&L for the first year. So how much it will be? What's the amount here? What's the amount here? Can I reply in the chat? $100 into 50 into $1 into 80% into 1/3. So it is 1333.3. Is it clear, everyone? So it's not, I know it's not a confusing question, but I have just given the main, these are the main elements you need to identify from a question. How many number of options, how many employees are there, especially when it's a equity settled share-based payment, will always refer to the fair value at the grant date. Okay, then we'll consider that it is $1. Then we should consider what's the percentage of employees who are expecting to exercise this. So it is 20% will leave. So we need to recognize the expense for remaining 80%. So 80% into 1/3. So it is 133.3. Is it clear? And remember that with respect to equity settled share-based payment, we don't need to make the changes we don't need to make any changes for the market-based vesting condition. Market-based vesting condition means, let's say, if the fair value of that option changes, we don't need to consider it. Because we assume that since it's the equity settled share-based payment, that market-based changes are already accounted in the fair value of that option at the grant date. It's already incorporated to the fair value of the option at the grant date. So with respect to equity settled share-based payment, we only need to account for the non-market based vesting condition. So that's the reason here we have accounted for the non-market based vesting condition. So we consider the percentage of employees leaving the company because that's a non-market. It's not specific to the market. The same way, let's say if they have given certain profit targets, if you have to meet this much profit targets, then this much percentage, then this much number of options will be provided. Okay, so in that scenario, we need to consider it, even if it's an equity settled share-based payment, because it's a non-market based vesting condition. Okay, so whenever it's an equity settled share-based payment, you need to remember this fact. You only need to account for the non-market based vesting conditions. We don't need to account for the market-based vesting conditions because we assume that it's already incorporated to the fair value of that option at the grant date. Is it clear, everyone? So even in the second year, they will give a fair value with respect to that option at the year end of year 2, but we don't need to account for it. Again, we'll only recognize the expense with respect to the fair value at the grant date itself. So with respect to equity settled share-based payment, we should always consider the fair value of the option at the grant date subsequently in every year end. Is it clear, everyone? Because we only need to account for the non-market based vesting condition. Okay. as well as, let's say, when you are issuing share-based payment or equity settled share-based payment to your employees, we know that we need to consider the fair value at the grant date to recognize the expense. But if it is to non-employees, if you are offering the equity settled share-based payment for non-employees, such as any of your customers or your suppliers, in that scenario, how will you account for it? It will be recorded with respect to the fair value of the goods or service received. If the fair value of the goods or service is not given, then we will consider the fair value of option at the grant date. Is it clear, everyone? Can you reply in the chat? Can you reply in the chat, guys? Okay, so these are the main elements you have to remember with respect to equity settled share-based payments. One, with respect to how to account for it. So always we should only consider the fair value at the grant date, and subsequently we don't need to consider the market-based vesting conditions. We only need to account for the non-market-based vesting conditions. Okay. Then now it's about cash settled share-based payment. So after all that, one of the example will be SAR. So with respect to cash settled share-based payment, every year we'll recognize the revenue with respect to the fair value of that option, the fair value of the SAR, with respect to the reporting date. So with respect not to the grant date, with respect to that relevant reporting date, what's the fair value? We'll use that to measure the expense in the every year. Okay. And other thing, always remember the SAR will get exercised at the intrinsic value. So what do you mean by intrinsic value of a SAR? What's the intrinsic value of an SAR? It's a value which is considering the time value of money of that option as well. The value which is considering the time value of money plus there is a value for that option plus the time value of money. The present value of its future cash flows plus the time value of money. So these both factors will consider together to calculate the intrinsic value of an SAR. So with respect to SAR, since it is getting settled in cash, it will get settled or it will get exercised at the intrinsic value. Okay. Another important factor you need to remember is till the vesting date, every year we have to remeasure it, as we have seen with respect to equity settled share-based payment. But the only difference is here we will consider the fair value of that SAR at the respective reporting date to remeasure the expense. Is it clear, guys? Okay, guys, so these are the main aspects we have to learn with respect to IFRS 2. Okay, the deferred tax with respect to equity settled share-based payment will be, we know that with respect to share-based payment, always the company will consider from the tax authority when this particular share-based payment is getting exercised. Only at that period in which that it will actually get exercised, the tax authority will give you the respective benefits. But we know that we used to account for that expense right from the beginning. The result, it will lead to a difference in the tax base and the carrying amount, and it will lead to a deferred tax. It will lead to a deferred tax asset. So there will be temporary difference with respect to the tax carrying amount and the tax base when it comes to this SPP, share-based payment schemes, because we know that the tax authority will consider this. Let's say if it is SIR, the tax authority will only consider it as an expense when it is actually getting exercised. But we are starting to recognize it right from the beginning. Okay, so as a result, there will be a difference, and this difference will give to a deferred tax asset, because in future anyway you are going to get a benefit there. So apart from that, you just need to know the treatment. So apart from that, they haven't tested any questions as such on the deferred tax element of share-based payment. Is it clear? Okay, guys, so that's it for the day. So we have covered the important standards such as IFRS 15, IFRS 16, then financial instrument, and I've covered IFRS 2 and IAS 19. So these are the main important standards we have to remember, and even we have discussed about IFRS 13 and other standards in the day one as well. So make sure that you go through these important standards, okay, and that will literally help you to score a majority of the marks, okay. And literally practice each and every questions from the standards which you have covered first, then move on to the next areas. So tomorrow we'll discuss about the groups and we'll discuss about the current issues in the next class. Okay. So that's it, guys.